Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Robbins, and welcome to Life, Death, and the Space Between podcast. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and medium, and here we explore life, death, consciousness, and what it all means. It is rare that I've had a guest on the show more than once, but I am so excited today to welcome back Mark Coleman, because Mark and I think it was probably the first season of my podcast, had an amazing, incredible conversation. I remember because it was around Memorial Day, because we did a Memorial Day meditation. I released it on Memorial Day. But Mark is back today, and Mark's journey with meditation began in his late teens in London as a punk rocker. He was drawn to the peace and clarity it brought. This path took him to India and the US, immersing in long retreats with renowned teachers in the insight meditation, including Christopher Titmuss, Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, and Sharon Salzberg, and later exploring Tibetan traditions of meditation. But it was meditating in nature that captured Mark's heart. When he moved to the US, he fell for the vast landscapes of the Rockies, Sierras, and the deserts of the Southwest. An unabashed nature lover, he sensed nature as the perfect temple for mindfulness and began integrating meditation and nature as a path of practice for himself and later teaching to others. He realized the joy, peace, wisdom, and freedom taught in Buddhism was accessible meditating outdoors. This led Mark to found Awake in the Wild, an organization dedicated to sharing the transformational power of meditation in nature. Through this initiative, he has led silent wilderness meditation retreats in California, Colorado, Alaska, Mexico, Peru, and New Mexico, taking people on inner and outdoor adventures that combine meditation with the awe-inspiring beauty and profundity of nature. Mark's new book, A Field Guide to Nature, is out now. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Amy. Great to be back with you on your show.
I could really use your help. If you haven't had a chance yet to listen to my season 5 opener, go back and listen to that. But in the event that you don't, I need your support. If you've been listening to me for a while, or even if you just started, you can go to Patreon and put in Dr. Amy Robbins, and there you can find different levels in which you can support the podcast financially. At this point, I have no ads. I have no sponsors. I am solely self-funding this podcast, and it would really help me out if you've gotten something out of this podcast, if you could donate $5, $10, or even $20 a month just to help me out, to help support the podcast. I'm continuing to work to try to get sponsors, to try to get advertisers, but until that happens, I need your help. And there are other ways to support the podcast. In addition to Patreon, you can like the podcast, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can rate and review the podcast. I always love reading your reviews. They're really heartwarming to me, and it's the emotional currency that I get from providing you with this resource. So please take a moment to just help me out here. You can also find the links in this episode, in the episode notes, as well as on my website at dramyrobbins.com. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Dr. Amy Robbins. Great to have you back as I look at you with this beautiful picturesque nature behind you. And I'm sitting in my son's bedroom with his sports paraphernalia. But Chicago versus California, I guess that's what we get. So I loved this book. I read the book. I'm downloading the Audible version as soon as I can really get back out into nature, but you don't even need it to be out in nature. Tell us about what meditating in nature is. It can be so much easier than just sitting in a meditation. What is it about nature that can bring us right into presence?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think for most of us, when we go outside, whether it's to our garden or a park or along where you are, the lake shore, or into the woods or along farmers' fields or whatever, the natural world has a way of just calling us, inviting us into the present. We go outside because it's beautiful, it's spacious, there's so much color and life and movement and beauty and dynamism. And so when we're trying to meditate, when we're trying to cultivate mindfulness, be present, we usually do that with our eyes closed, maybe in our bedroom or in some room in our house. And it's challenging because mostly we spend our time thinking, worrying, planning, ruminating. And that's what we struggle with in the meditation is we're just constantly lost in thought. When we go outside, what's happening is there's so much drawing us into the present, right? The sounds of birds, the movement of the leaves in the trees, the smell of the fresh air, the cloudscapes, the dew on the grass, the animals, or, there's just so much life. Mm. And that naturally draws us into the present. We don't have to try to be focused on the lake. You look at the lake because it's beautiful. You look at the glassiness of the water. You look at the ripples. You look at the birds skimming the surface. And so if we take the word meditation away and just talk about being present and being mindful, when we're outside, it's as if we're meditating, or as I say, being mindful quite effortlessly. We just walk and we come into the present. And of course, we might worry and think and plan and do all the things that we do mentally. But our thoughts are so much more in the background because what happens when we go outside, our senses wake up and our sensory connection wakes up. And we come into this world that's mostly beautiful and interesting. And it invites curiosity, which calls us more into the present. And so it's what I like to say, it's an easeful, relaxed, natural way of being aware, which is being mindful, which is what's happening in meditation. So it's both easeful and it's also joyful. So it's a pleasure I often joke, like I was teaching this week on the cliffs here in the Pacific coast. Beautiful spring day, the California poppies were out, it was beautiful surf, blue sky. And I make the joke, why wouldn't you want to be present? Why wouldn't you want to be mindful in this moment? Because it's beautiful, right? When I'm in my basement and it's a cold winter day and I'm, meditating and struggling with my own thoughts, it's not that inviting to be present to. But when we're outside, it's like it's a joy and an ease.
Gosh, I have so many thoughts going through my head, starting with, as you were speaking, when I stepped out of my house this morning to walk, the birds were, I think maybe I was just sort of heightened because I knew we were doing this interview today and I had just read through the book. I really did notice in a different way, like the feeling of the cold on my skin. Right. And how it actually normally I've been working very hard to try to resist my distaste for the cold living in Chicago. So that was sort of like my goal for 2023 was like, don't hate the winter so much. But the aliveness that you feel in the cold is something. And someone said this to me once. They said, I love the winter because I feel more alive. And I thought, oh, wow, that's interesting. Maybe I could reframe how I see winter. So I'm trying to be more mindful of that. But also like the birds chirping was like this beautiful song. And I was thinking, okay, great. Spring's coming, right? The birds are chirping, spring's coming. And it just set such a different mood for how I started my day. And I was like, I should do this more often. And then I was like, but it's cold.
Right. Well, you've got to have the right clothes. You've got to bundle up like hell, especially if you're in the Midwest, Chicago in the winter and there's wind chill and all of that. And bundle up as much as you can and then, go out for short periods. But as you say, when we do go out, it is refreshing. It's stimulating, that cold breeze against the skin, and then the sound of birds, or our heart feels warm because like, oh, the birds are coming back. That's the first sign of spring. Or I might notice the buds on the trees just growing a little bit, or the snow starting to melt, or there's so many things. Or sometimes it's cold, but it's a blue, sunny day. And that's very enlivening, and we're creatures of pleasure. We're pleasure seekers. And so there's so much pleasure that we can feel outside, even when it's cold. And the pleasure draws us into the present. And so that's why nature is such a powerful invitation, because there's so much joy to be had.
So that gets me thinking, this isn't a question I had, but what is your take on the joy of sunsets? Because this is something to me that's so fascinating, is like wherever you go in the world, people seem obsessed with watching the sunset, right? Like restaurants charge extra to have a table where you can see the sunset, and people gather for the sunset and they clap when the sun sets. And this is something that happens every single day. Right. All over the world. And yet every single time people want to witness it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what you're speaking to is something very ancient and primal, right? We, as a species, we lived in nature, right? Without buildings, without houses for hundreds of thousands of years. And so can you imagine that intimacy with the cycles? We were really tracking the cycle of the moon, the phases of the moon. We would wake up with the sunrise. We would go to sleep with the sunset. And we would track the seasons and the migrating birds. And so it's so instilled in our DNA to track nature, because that's how we survive, right? Without tracking nature, you die. If you're not aware of the coming winter and you're not preparing, you'll die. And so, and so I think the sun, as you're pointing to, for me, it's the sunrise, because I see sunrise from my house, and I get up early anyway, just because I do. And I actually started leading a sunrise meditation during the pandemic, because I knew a lot of people couldn't leave their houses, and I could see sunrise from my house. So my orientation is sunrise, but as you say, for many it's sunset, because I guess a lot of people aren't up for sunrise. and there's something, and it's a question I often ask myself is, why do we experience it as beautiful, right? The sun's going down, it gets more red, orange, whatever, clouds get red. But there's a way that it's not just an experience that we notice, but something touches us that's beautiful. And as you say, it's a universal experience. And I think there's something both mysterious about that, but it's also beautifully connecting. Like, you could be sitting in a restaurant and people could have extremely different political views, but they all love the sunset, right? Also extremely different cultures, conditioning, financial status, class, whatever, but there's like, oh, right, there's this common humanity, that we live on this earth and we appreciate the things of this earth. And there's something very beautiful about we can come together, and nature's a way of sensing our common humanity.
And how do you have so many different methods and means to use nature to connect us. Can you walk us through a bit about how you bring people to those places of connection? I mean, the book is broken down in these great, kind of there's chapters, obviously, but like little genres, I guess, of sensory and seasons and, cycles and everything. So can you talk a little about that?
Yeah. So the intention for the book, The Field Guide to Nature Meditation, was, I've been teaching this work for 20 some years. I've been doing it for probably 30 years myself. And I wanted to give people a guide of, how do you do this? How do you go outside and meditate? How do you go outside and be mindful? How can you use see your time out in nature as part of your spiritual practice, whatever your spiritual tradition is? being out in nature with mindfulness, with awareness, is a spiritual practice, regardless of your faith. It's the original church temple, and in my book. And so there's a lot of different practices that you can choose from, depending on where you are, depending on the environment, depending on the season, depending on how much time you have, depending on whether you want to sit down or whether you want to stroll or whether you want to lie down. And so what I do when I bring people outside, and there's sort of I can sort of condense all of those many, many practices into, a few kind of essential principles. And one of them is, whenever you go outside, whether it's to your garden or a park or a woodland, the first thing I invite people to do is to arrive. And what I mean by that, of course, we've already arrived in the park, say, but our body's there, but it takes time to really to feel into a landscape, to be, just like you go to a park and you sit on the park bench, and then you just close your eyes for a moment and you just notice the sounds. You notice the sounds of the rippling leaves, or the squirrels chuckling, or the birds chattering, or the kids playing in the playground. And then you notice the smells, right? We rarely notice smells. So you take a moment to breathe, or you notice your breath and notice, the park smells very woody today because we've had lots of rain and I can smell the humus of the earth. Or you just take a moment to look around and let your attention attune to the canopy and the grasses and the sky. And so that arriving practice is just, we slow down, we come into our senses, right? So be curious about what we're seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. And then we try to let go of the thinking mind that's always busy labeling and analyzing. And so we might look at a tree and we go, oh, that's an oak tree. And then we stop looking at it because we've identified it, but we haven't actually got to know that oak tree. We just labeled it. What's it like to then drop the label and go, what is this oak tree that's got this very wide girth, that has a broken limb, that's half in leaf and half not, that's got these thick roots stretching into the earth, that's a different color gray than the one behind it. And so we bring an intimacy and a curiosity. And then there's a lot of different ways we can interface with nature. One of my favorite practices, and there's a whole bunch of them in the book, meandering. Meandering is a way we just, in what in England we call bimbling, where we just wander through a landscape without any direction and just letting the body attune to whether it might be beauty or to smells or to be curious about what you can touch, or to what's growing or what's decaying. And then, or you might do some standing meditations where you stand against a tree, leaning against a tree, facing a tree. Or you do a lying meditation where it's summer, it's warm, like it's grass, and you lie down and you let yourself sort of feel the earth on your back body and dissolve, and just relax, melt into the earth. And there's so many ways to be in a landscape, move in a landscape. And then then some of the practices I isolate. You do a seeing meditation where all you do is gazing at the landscape, noticing all the colors and the forms and the movements. Or you close your eyes and do a listening meditation. Maybe you're by a stream, or you're by a waterfall, or the ocean, and or it's a windy day and you're just listening to sounds. So there's just so many avenues to connect with nature and then to deepen that awareness, deepen the sensitivity.
I mean, I'm like, when's your next retreat and how can I sign up for it? It sounds, I mean, nature is, I think, one of our greatest healers, and we're hearing more and more how important it is. But you're just pointing out, like, I almost think it's just the bringing you into the present moment could be enough.
Yeah.
And we would be much better off than where we are today in terms of healing. Yeah.
I mean, my main advice to people at the end of anything that I teach is two words, but I say it a few times. I say, go outside, go outside, go outside. And that might be this, and like I live in a sort of a mixed sort of suburban neighborhood. I'm on the edge of, not far from San Francisco, and just walking around the neighborhood, there's trees, there's bushes, there's neighbors' gardens, there's flowers, there's birds coming, there's always sky, there's always, sunlight, clouds, stars. So anytime we go outside, we usually come more into the present, right? When we're indoors, we tend to think more, ruminate more, and it's all about me, myself, and I, my life, and my problems, and my whatever. We go outside, we go, oh, it's spring. I'd forgotten it was spring, or it's late winter. Oh, it's the moon is crescent moon right now. Oh, and I noticed the starlings have migrated back from wherever they come from in the winter, and there's little blossoms coming up, or there's the crocuses and the daffodil. It kind of wakes us up. It brings us into the present, brings us into our senses. And usually when we forget about ourselves, or ourselves and our problems and our dramas are in the background, we tend to feel better. We tend to feel less stress. And the research shows, as you pointed to, heart rate goes down, cortisol level goes down, stress levels go down, well-being, happiness levels go up. Like, it's very clear. And so that's why I say go outside, even if it's just down your street and you're looking at the light from the sun on the buildings or on the occasional tree, or you're noticing grasses in the sidewalk. Like, there's something very connecting, engaging. And when we're in the present, our stress levels tend to lower and we feel more connected. And again, we tend to, especially during the pandemic and now post-pandemic, there's so much isolation happened, so much separation. And going outside, we feel more connected. Maybe you say hello to a neighbor. Maybe you see a bird that you like. I'm looking at this crow. There's a pair of crows that build a nest every year in this oak tree outside my house, and they're building the nest right now. I go outside, I'm like, oh, there they are. They're back again, raising their young, and it just connects me with cycles of life. That just, it warms my heart. Just like, as you said, like looking at the sunset, there's something engaging and heartwarming about it.
So you started mentioning the cycles of life, and this podcast is called Life, Death, and the space between. So as you know, death, you and I have talked before, that death is a topic that I enjoy talking about because I think it brings people closer to life. But how does nature help us get more comfortable with that death?
Yeah, so I teach and point to this a lot in my nature retreats and programs. You can't go anywhere outside. You can't look at anything in nature and not see the cycle of birth, of growth, generation, flourishing, decay, disintegration, death, transformation, renewal, birth, growth, flourishing, decay, death. Like, you look at even the most pristine grassy lawn, right? There's green grasses, there's fresh grasses, and there's something decaying, right? You look at a tree, like this tree behind me, it's a beautiful, healthy oak tree, but there's, you can see there's gashes in the trunk, and there's dead limbs, and there's decaying leaves, and everywhere you go in nature, you'll see things that are growing, things that are dying. You walk through the forest. I walk through the redwood forest here where I live. Beautiful trees that have been around for 1,000, 2,000 years. And there's trees fallen down that have been on the ground for 200, 300, 500 years. They're slow to disintegrate, the redwoods. And so you see this beautiful, and then you see the saplings growing. And you see these great giants, like in these big storms we've had, some of these big giants just thunder to the ground. Sometimes I hear them when I'm walking, crashing. And it reminds us, nature reminds us that cycle of growth, flourishing, decay, and death, and rebirth, of regrowth and death is natural, and it's part of everything. And it normalizes it. And it reminds us, oh, this is life. Life living is growing and aging and dying. And what I love about nature when someone says, oh, that's a dead tree, I say, well, it's no longer growing, but often the trees that we call dead, they actually harbor more life than when they're living. Insects, woodpecker nests, squirrels' nests, mycelium, all kinds of life are happening. And I love walking through a forest, like I teach in New Mexico, northern New Mexico, and I walk through these ponderosa groves, and there's these ponderosa trees that have been lying on the ground for probably 100 years, 200 years. And all you can see of the tree is a line of like sawdust, like the bark has disintegrated. So there's just a line of this reddish bark in the soil that was a tree that's now dissolved into becoming the soil that will soon become grasses and flowers and then a new ponderosa tree. So you get to see also that the dead tree is actually not dead. It's just becoming the food for new life. And then sometimes also there's a tree that I've loved. I've been teaching at this place for 20 years, going there for 30 years. It's this old ponderosa. It's dead. We call dead. But it's been standing for 30 years, and it's gnarled and it's pockmarked and there's limbs falling off, and it's beautiful. And I love it. And I stare at it. It's right facing this lodge I teach in. And nature teaches us that death is also beautiful. It's natural. There's a grace to it. There's a dignity to it. There's a naturalness to it. There's a rightness to it. And that's something that communicates something to us that, oh, right. It's not a problem. It's not an aberration. It's just, that's what happens. We get old, we get sick, and we die. And I think it settles something in our nervous system and normalizes something our medical system can see as a problem or as a mistake.
Well, and I think, I'm just thinking as you're talking, we took our kids on vacation of a lifetime this Christmas to the Galapagos Islands.
Oh, nice.
And part of it is I want them to experience more nature, because I always say they're city mice. And so they're not super well versed in how nature works. And there were lots of dead sea lions, baby sea lions that would be laying on the rocks. And myself included, and my kids would say, oh, that's so sad. And the guide's response was, it's just nature. Like there was no, and they would say, well, what happened? And oftentimes they would say, well, maybe they were sick, or there was not enough food, or the mom couldn't get back quick enough, or whatever it was. But it's so interesting how, as we as a society, I think, have gotten further and further away from nature and from, most people aren't farmers anymore. They're not, dealing with those cycles of life that happen all the time.
Right.
We are more fearful of that death in a way that I think when you see it every single day as part of the landscape of life, really, like death sustains life, what you're saying, right. In so many, yes. And right, if there was no death, animals couldn't live, they couldn't eat, they couldn't survive.
Exactly. Right.
But the further we get away from that, the harder it is to remember that is our natural state, really.
Yeah. I teach these kayaking meditation retreats.
Oh my God, I'm so coming to one of your retreats. There's so many things I want to do. I got to figure out how to do them, but
right. One of these days.
List. Right.
One of these days. So I do these kayaking retreats down in Sea of Cortez in Baja, Mexico, and you were paddling along the shoreline, and the shoreline, usually craggy, rocky, it's a graveyard of crab bones, fish bones, seabird bones, skeletons, starfish washed up. And it's this, and they're sometimes colorful, sometimes bleached by the sun. And it's just, as you say, it's just nature. It's what happens. The sea is abundant with fish and crabs, and they live, and then they get old, or they get sick and they die, or they get eaten. Seagulls grab them and throw them on the rocks, and it's natural, and it's And as you say, yeah, when we live in the city, we don't see death, we don't see decay. But when we're in nature, we come across skulls, we come across carcasses of elk or deer or whatever it might be. And it's like, oh yeah, right. That's what happens in the wild. There's life and there's death. And as you say, how could the wolves or the coyotes or whatever it is, how would they survive if they weren't able to, kill and continue that cycle? And so it's something very sobering and right and natural about it. That's really healthy for us to experience.
Well, and I think in the city too, like the only time I see death is like a rat hit by a garbage truck, right? Which is kind of, sadly, I root for that sometimes, given the rat infestation, which is terrible to say, but it doesn't feel natural in that way. Mm-hmm. Whereas in nature, in a more natural setting, it feels more natural. Like this still feels like, got hit by, society.
Right. It wasn't quite exactly part of the natural ecosystem.
Right.
Yeah.
And then someone scoops it up, right, and dumps it into like a trash bin versus like the process of an animal coming to eat it or whatever it is.
Right. Watch it decay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How can we appreciate nature without this dichotomy around what are we doing to our planet?
The more we go out into nature, the more we appreciate it. The more we appreciate it, the more we tend to love and care for it. And the more we want to take care of it, steward it, protect it. Right? If we, for example, if, maybe you live on the edge of town and there's, maybe some farmland, maybe some mixed woodland, and, as urban sprawl happens, that particular farm, gets bought up by developers or wants to be, and they want to put a new mall, or a new subdevelopment. If we just read that in the newspaper, like, oh, they're going to expand the town into this area, we'll just like, oh, well, we need the housing. It's, that's so fine. But if we live next to that farm and we've got to know those old, cedars or poplars or the maples or the waterfowl that come and hang out in the pond in winter or whatever it is, we will care for it and we will love it and we want to protect it. It's like, no, we don't need more malls. We don't need to build over this beautiful farmland and concrete over it. No, we need to protect the trees and the farm and the land. And so my work is driven by this sentiment. We protect what we love. And we will fight and care for what we love, and we'll take care of it. And so the more that we go out into nature and appreciate it, love it, then we will care about what's happening. We'll care about the ways that we're polluting the rainforest with drilling and mining and oil exploration, or the way we're damaging the coral reefs because of the rising sea temperatures, or wherever we're seeing the earth being hurt or where species are being threatened. If we have an alive, connected, real, visceral relationship with nature, then we feel it. We feel like, oh my God, we're harming ourselves. Like the earth is not something, not some pretty thing over there. It's our life. It's our home. It's our family. And just as if someone was harming your own family, you would be very fierce in protecting and caring. When we love and care for the earth, when we love the earth and appreciate it, yeah, we want to do something about it. We want to, I was just reading about the Salt Lake by Salt Lake City that's draining. It's gone down, I think, 70%. It's at risk of actually disappearing in 20 years. That whole vast swathe of beautiful salt lakes that are home, that 10 million birds migrate through the salt lakes, right? If that lake dries up, those 10 million birds might die, because they need that stopover between wherever they're flying from Mexico, probably up to Alaska, or wherever their journey is, or to Canada. And so when we know that, it's like, oh, if 10 million, but maybe you're a bird lover, or maybe you're not, but you know that there used to be 100,000 swans on that lake. And my friend of a friend who was there recently saw 7, like the numbers are precipitously falling. And when we get that, it's like, oh, yes, we need water for houses and agriculture. And if we don't have water for wildlife and the rivers and the salmon and the birds, we're going to live in a world without species. And we can't survive in a world without species. We need complex diversity. The science shows that when there's more diversity of life, whether it's forest, plants, animals, birds, fish, then life is more abundant. The less diverse, the less species, the more life struggles. That's why we have the Dust Bowl crisis in the 30s, because we have these monoculture crops taking over the prairies. So to your question, and then the paradox is, when we love the earth, when we care about it, we want to protect it, and we also feel the pain and the grief around the loss of species, the loss of wildlife, the loss of coral reefs, the loss of, you name it, that what ecosystem or species is not under some kind of threat. And so, it very much pertains to your work around grief and loss, that as our heart opens to caring and loving the earth, we also have to be courageous enough to feel the sadness, to feel the grief, to feel the loss, to feel the pain, to feel grief. Like, as not a day goes by, I don't feel some twinge or sometimes some heartbreak or some tears or some outrage about what's happening to this beautiful earth and the beautiful species that are under threat. But it's just like, as you talk about in your work around grieving, just as important to grieve the loss of a loved one, it's also important that we grieve the loss of maybe a particular, meadow we used to go to as kids. Like for so many of us, the places we played, like the forests I played in kids, they're now developments. The farms I played in, they're urban sprawl. And so we have to grieve, and the grieving's part of the healing and also part of not numbing and the part of helping us actually at some point engage, so we don't keep doing this destruction that we seem hell-bent on doing.
Yeah, and I guess as you're talking, part of me was feeling a little bit hopeless. Because it's like, well, what am I going to do? Me, little me, right? Like, I think a lot of people have that feeling, like this feels insurmountable when, I had it here. There was a house behind me. I live on an alley, which is not very beautiful, but there was this big, beautiful tree in this backyard that had probably been there for 100+ years. I mean, it was so gorgeous. And I could see it as I looked out my back. And a developer came in, chopped it down, and built a condo. Yeah. That is not beautiful. There's nothing beautiful about the stairs and the garage of this condo. And it's just like, you feel helpless in those situations, because it's like they don't care about the big, beautiful tree. They care about, can they maximize the space to make as much money as they possibly can? And where's the balance? I'm not like anti-capitalism, but where's the balance in all of this between, finding that preservation of natural beauty and coming up against that, like, corporate capitalist.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, these are, if you care about the earth and you care about land and you care about people who are disenfranchised and you care about indigenous communities whose land's getting taken over for oil and coal and mineral extraction, all of that, it's hard. These are hard times to be mindful of that, to be aware of that. And there's also amazing, amazing things happening. There's so many indigenous communities, tribes, whether it's in the Amazon or in Indonesia, who are becoming, who are getting resources and learning how to defend and protect their lands and the rainforest. I was just chatting with a friend about Doug Tompkins, who was a he ran Esprit, the clothing company, sold it, made a bunch of money, and he moved to part-time to Chile and Argentina, and he started buying massive tracts of land. And this was in the Pinochet era, where land was extremely cheap. So he bought I think tens of millions of acres, like tens of pristine mountains, lakes, valleys, wilderness, like pristine wilderness. And initially there was pushback because, like, who's this gringo coming down buying all our land? And he donated it to the Chilean government or Chilean government. And I think that the Tompkins Foundation, they've helped create like about 30 national parks in Chile and Argentina. There's one person with a vision who brought in, of course, other people, engaged local communities and governments, and they've preserved like tens of millions of acres of this beautiful wildlife, mountains, rivers. And so we also have to look at what is happening that's positive, what is happening that people are doing that's constructive. Yes, there's destruction and there's sprawl and there's species loss, and there's millions of organizations and hundreds of millions of people who are every day, protecting their watershed. They're restoring the wetlands. They're trying to undam the dams and protect the salmon and, help the corridors for the monarch butterflies so they have a healthier route, and stopping, a friend who won a lawsuit proving to the EPA that glyphosates, which are Roundup, which has destroyed so much soil and waterways, they finally got the EPA to rule that it was carcinogenic and that it's going to be illegal to use it, which means it's going to allow some restoration of soil health and allow pollinators and bees and birds and rivers to not be so polluted. So we really have to look at the good news, and there's tons of good news. We don't hear about the good news because our media reports on all the, the latest coral reef bleach, the latest species loss, the latest, urban or, ecological crisis. But there are so many heartwarming, positive, young people, becoming farmers, renewing the soil and stewarding the land and taking better care of animals. And, just endless. Any way you look, there's people and organizations doing good work. And so there's a phrase, action eats anxiety. And so if you're feeling anxious, despair, hopeless, the invitation is find something you care about. It might be birds. It might be farms. It might be butterflies. It might be rivers. It might be the oceans and marine animals. Find an organization, find people that care about what you do, get involved and feel like, and see how you can make a difference in a small way. And then if you think about I think it's at least hundreds of millions of people around the world who love the earth, who care about the earth. And you think about, we do make a difference together. Collectively, we make a difference. Individually, it's very, very small. I plant flowers so I can attract butterflies and pollinators. That helps maybe 3 butterflies in my neighborhood have enough nectar so they can reproduce or fly to their homeland, whatever. Right? 3 butterflies. Well, it's better than no butterflies.
Right. Right.
So, and if each one of us did that, that's a lot of butterflies or a lot of bees or a lot of pollinators or a lot of whatever it is that we're protecting.
You're making me want to get out, plant more, just like be conscious of what I can do even in a city.
Yeah. I have a student she lives in Denver, and she's an environmentalist, and she turned her garden into a native garden, which doesn't look as pretty as all these foreign species we normally plant our gardens with. But she said as soon as she planted the native species, then the more insects came, and with more insects, more birds came, more butterflies came. And then if you have enough people doing that in a big urban sprawl like Chicago or Denver, then the insects and the birds and the bees, they can navigate through this big concrete sprawl because there's actually enough pollen, enough things for them, enough food, right? And so that does actually make a difference, you know.
So one other question, you talk about how you don't have to actually be outdoors to meditate on the outdoors. So for people who don't, for whatever reason, aren't in maybe a safe neighborhood where they can be outdoors, or, are working jobs that they get in their car, they drive to work, they get in their car, they drive home, and then they have to, how can we bring nature to us when we can't step out to nature? No, thanks for that. It's an important question. And I had someone on my retreat the other day, and it's been cold here and it's been quite stormy and rainy. And she says, cold. California cold, which is like wimpy cold. Right. Which is probably a mild day for you, right? Exactly. Today is your cold.
It was probably 40. Right. It was probably 45, but it was pouring rain. And so there's a couple of meditations in the book, and one of them is meditating by a window, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like in your house, if you can, try to find a window or a door. She sat by an open door, a back door, I think, and where you have some view of something natural. It might be the sky, might be a sliver of sky, might be clouds, it might be a tree that's, across the street in someone's garden like you used to have. And then just let your attention just relax your body, and then just gaze at whatever you can see that's natural, So I teach this with people I was teaching these folks for the New York Times, actually, in their offices. They're in Manhattan somewhere, Midtown, urban sprawl.
They're like straining their neck. They're like, wait, I see.
But they did have a conference room, and they did have some windows, and there's actually a lot of trees that people plant on their rooftops in New York. And there's usually always sky. Sky, clouds, blue, whatever it is, blue, gray, doesn't matter. And just having some space, some distance, and paying attention to anything that's natural. Or you do what I do is this is an orchid that I keep rescuing, and it keeps flowering. Or you bring plants in and you just gaze at your plant. Plants are beautiful. And even when I look at this orchid, whether it's the leaves or the flowers, for, a minute, 5 minutes, there's something about nature, that anything that's natural, right? When you look at that, can you see that orchid? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you look at that versus you look at this,
he's holding up glasses for people who can't see. They're not quite as beautiful. It's
different. I mean, the glasses are okay, but there's something, again, it's going back to this thing that we maybe didn't grow up in nature with orchids, but something in our DNA recognizing, there's something like the smallest thing in nature can remind us of the natural world, which could be a leaf, a flower, a glimpse of sky, a tree out your window, a window box, or even just you open the door and you're listening to the sound of rain or hail. Mm-hmm. There's something, or even just feeling the fresh air, even if it's cold. There's something about that connects us with something greater than ourselves, greater than our urban life. And so just, sit by a window and I do this a lot. I have a window, I have a view of trees and water and sky, and I just gaze a lot, like maybe between meetings, maybe do a lot of Zoom meetings. So in between Zoom meetings, rather than jump on your phone, just take 5 minutes and just gaze out for the furthest thing you can see, or open a window and listen if there's sounds of birds or wind or rain. And just that can be very, very nourishing, or get a plant and stick it on your desk and enjoy, I love tending to plants. There's also something beautiful about gardening and tending and bringing things to life. Get some seeds and watch how this miracle of life of a seed becomes, a little budding tomato plant, or, there's something lovely about that sunflower,
So I lied. My last question is, how do we incorporate, because you have this book on Audible, which you said is recommended because you can do you talk through the meditations.
Right. I guide them. Yeah.
How do you recommend using your guided meditations into being in nature? Because obviously if we're on our phone, we're not in nature. It's the paradox of life.
Sure. Yeah, no, definitely. So, so two of my books are on Audible. This one, the Nature Field Guide to Nature Meditation. And so what I recommend is you download it to your phone, put your headphones on, go out onto your balcony, a deck, go into your garden, go into a park, go anywhere there's nature around. The further afield, the better. And then find somewhere comfortable to sit, or take a folding chair or a cushion or something, or lean up against a tree, or sit on a bench or rock. And then just put on one of the meditations that attracts you. It might be listening meditation. It might be gazing at the sky. It might be or you might do it meandering, and you do a meandering with beauty or meandering with joy. And you just, hear the instructions. And then once you've heard enough, you can, turn them off and then just meditate without the guidance, or you can just fully use the guidance the whole time. But it's a very nice way to sort of immerse yourself with guidance outside. Well,
Mark, another great interview. So thank you. If people want to find out about your retreats, what you're offering, this book, your previous books, tell us where they can find that.
Yeah, so I have two main websites. My name's markcoleman.org. So markcoleman.org. That's Mark with a K, Coleman with an E, markcoleman.org. And that has my, books and lots of free resources, meditations, talks.
You have tons of free meditations on there too.
Yeah,
I saw
lots
today.
of them. Yeah. So get those, listen to those. There's my schedule. And then I have another website, an organization called awakeinthewild.com. And that has information about my nature retreats. And actually, both websites have information about my nature retreats. I'm mostly doing teacher training these days. So I run mindfulness teacher trainings in the US, in Bay Area, and in Europe, France. And I run Awake in the Wild nature meditation teacher trainings in the US and in Europe. So you can get information about those. I'm on a bunch of apps. I just got on to put a nature meditation series onto the Waking Up app, which is a great meditation app. And I have a course coming up. If people are interested, I've got a 6-week course starting in April. It's called Mindfulness-Based Nature Experience. And it's an evening class that's on Zoom. But the idea, it's an afternoon, evening class. The idea is you hopefully can be outside while you're taking the class. And so I'm guiding you sort of indoor, outdoor.
Will this be evergreen? Because this probably won't air until after your class.
Will you? Yes. So I have a lot of evergreen classes. If you go to markcoleman.org, I have quite a few nature meditation evergreen courses you can do. Yeah.
Wow, lots of resources. Thank you.
Resources, yeah.
Yeah, I just noticed you had all those meditations, so I'm definitely gonna be my new morning guru.
Great, good. And hopefully you get to be outside when it's warm enough and sunny enough.
It is, and I've got a pretty decent amount of trees outside my windows.
Nice.
And I see there. It's interesting because this one right in front of me right now, it still has leaves on it from the fall, but then the new buds start to bloom and the dead leaves don't seem to totally fall off until the new blooms have come, which is interesting because it's like, is it dead? Is it not dead? Did it go dormant? Like what happened? And it's a surprise. So
nice.
Thank you for making me more conscious and aware of just being out, and trying when I am out to be more present to what is happening. Cause I think it's So often, I'm like rushing from one thing to another. And I think that this will really make me pause a little bit more and think about what exactly it is I'm seeing and feeling and experiencing. So
Great.
Thanks, Mark.
Great.
And I'll be ready for book number 3. So let me know, or maybe it's more than book number 3, but we've only done 2 interviews on your book. So when the next one comes out, I'd love to have you back.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Great to be with you. Thanks.
Like what you heard today and want to hear more? Wondering what comes next and what it all means? Head over to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts and hit subscribe. Also, if you could take a minute to rate and review my podcast, I would really appreciate it. Stay tuned as we continue to explore life, death, and the space between.